Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, the Sorensen Center at CUNY Law School, now located on ancestral Lenape and Canarsie homelands, recognizes the long-standing significance of these lands for Indigenous peoples past and present. We believe that historical awareness of Indigenous exclusion and erasure is critically important and are committed to working to overcome their effects in our own educational institutions. Thank you all for being here for the Critical Voices event featuring Robbie Kaplan, founding partner of Kaplan Hecker. Prior to starting her own firm, she was a litigation partner at Paul Weiss, Rivkin, Wharton, and Garrison, where Ted Sorensen practiced for several decades. And when I invited Robbie to join for this, given all that she has on her plate, it only took her a very short moment to reply. And she said, I really love Ted, so I'm happy to do this. In our virtual room, we are pleased to have members of Ted's family. I see Gillian Sorensen, Ted's widow, who serves as the Sorensen Center's honorary board chair, has joined, and Ted Sorensen's daughter, Juliette Sorensen, who runs Injustice Watch from Chicago. I'm also happy to see Ted's longtime assistant, Marge Hornblower, here. And I believe we'll be joined by Steve Rosenfeld, who is Ted Sorensen's partner, and many others who've been so instrumental in the inception of the Sorensen Center. The Sorensen Center, named after Ted, is a vibrant center, and its focus is peace and justice. From New York City to border states and around the world, we work to protect rights of those affected by instability, conflict, and repression. As we all wait for the verdict in the murder trial of Derek Chauvin, it's clear that the conclusion will not erase the outrage felt since the murder of George Floyd. Today marks exactly 150 years since the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. After the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, violent racists were targeting newly freed slaves who exercised their rights. The act was then implemented by the President Grant, and Congress to protect against this violence. And sadly, this act is now relevant today. It's newly relevant. So we're fortunate to have with us Robbie Kaplan to tell us more. Under the KKK Act, she is suing the neo-Nazis who attacked in Charlottesville in 2017. She has 3 cases against Donald Trump. She represents E. Jean Carroll in a defamation suit, clients tricked by the American Communications Network marketing scheme, and Mary Trump, his niece. And yes, this is the Robbie Kaplan that we all know and love from her representation of Edie Windsor and her victory at the US Supreme Court, paving the way for gay marriage. And this is the woman who on Twitter describes herself this way: mother, wife, lawyer, in that order. Now I'm going to turn over to the wonderful Scott Kennedy, who's an associate at Paul Weiss in the litigation department. He's a recent CUNY Law alum, and he was an enthusiastic participant in Sorensen Center programming. Thank you, Scott. And Robbie, over to you.
Thanks, Camille. So as Camille mentioned, my name is Scott Kennedy, and I'm so pleased to preside over this discussion. It's special to me to participate in this talk with Robbie, to continue to participate in Sorensen Center events, and to share in the nexus and history of relationships with the Sorensen Center. So thanks to all of you who submitted questions in advance, which will help to guide my questions. After half an hour of discussion, we'll open it up to a Q&A. So please continue to use the chat and raise your hand later. So Robbie, before we dive into details of your current cases, starting with the KKK Act Charlottesville, let's set the stage and talk more about your current law firm, Kaplan Hecker, which was started in 2017. Will you share with us your decision to start your own law firm?
That would take a long time, and I don't want to spend the entire conversation talking about that. Before I say that, let me tell an anecdote about Ted that his wife and his daughter may not know, but it kind of typifies what Ted meant to me. So when I started at Paul Weiss, I graduated law school in 1991. I then clerked for a federal district court judge in Boston for a year. And when I came back to Paul Weiss to start as an associate, it was a very unusual time in the sense that there was kind of a recession going on in litigation. Unusual generally, and certainly unusual at Paul Weiss. And they were trying to encourage, understandably so, associates who were entering the firm, who had entered to become litigators, to switch to practices that were busier, like the corporate practice. So one day I'm sitting in my office and I get a call from Ted asking me to lunch. And of course, obviously, there was no way I was going to say no to going to lunch with Ted. So we went to lunch, and during the lunch, he told me about his practice and how he acted essentially as an international constitutional lawyer, helping various countries throughout the world start and draft and implement their own constitutions. He told me I had been a Russian history major in college, and he said he noted that I had, at least at one point, been fluent in Russian, and that he has a lot of clients and countries he's working with in the former Soviet republics. And would I like to come work with him on this incredibly exciting practice? And I remember being very tempted for sure, but I paused for a couple of minutes and I said, thank you very much, Mr. Sorensen. I always called him Mr. Sorensen. Thank you very, very much. I'm so honored by this request. But I really want to be a litigator. I came to Paul Weiss to be a litigator, and that's what I want to do with my life. And again, I could not be more honored by this, but I'm so sorry I'm going to have to turn you down in working with you on your practice. So that was the end of that. Of course, he couldn't have been more of a gentleman and more classy about it. Years go by. And then several years later, as a probably mid-level associate, I was assigned to a case to work with Ted. And the litigation partner working on the case asked me to come into this conference room where Ted was sitting with a client and some others. And he said to Ted, Ted, I want to introduce you, I don't know if you know, maybe I was still junior, to this junior litigation associate, Robbie Kaplan. And Ted looked up at me and he said, oh, I know Robbie Kaplan. He said, well, she and I had lunch, and kind of referring to the past history. And what was so great about the story is I was very nervous coming into this room, obviously. And he just couldn't have been more of a gentleman and a mensch about it. It made me feel completely comfortable, and also vindicated to me that I was completely right in making the decision I had a few years before, and how much he respected it. So it's just one of the examples in which Ted Sorensen was a complete mensch, but it's something I will never forget. So Kaplan Hecker. So I had been thinking in the 2016 election, like many of us probably watching this, that Hillary Clinton was going to become the president. And that I was hoping, I'd been working with the campaign, and I'd been hoping that I'd be privileged enough to get an opportunity to work with the administration at the Department of Justice, something I'd always wanted to do in my life. And there was talk maybe of me being the head of the civil division. And I'd even gone so far as to ask my apartment building in New York, my co-op, if we could sublet the apartment for a couple of years. And there was a particular school that we really wanted my son to go to in DC, and I was working every connection I knew to see if I could try to get him into that school. And then the election happened. And I knew instinctually, I think many of us did, that when Trump was elected, he presented new and really unprecedented risk to this country, not only to the public policy of this country and just a host of different ways, but frankly, to our legal and constitutional foundations. And I had a sense that, which turned out to be right, that many of the public interest groups were going to be very busy, public interest law groups, were going to be very, very busy doing what I call Trump defense. They were going to be super busy defending against his immigration policies, his gender related, you name it, but they were going to be super busy doing that. And of course I was right about that. And because Trump uniquely, and this is what our ACN case that Camille mentioned is about, because he uniquely retained his business interests in a way that no other president ever has, I was wondering whether there was some way to use commercial litigation that I had grown up doing at Paul Weiss in a way to combat what I saw to be the dangers involving Donald Trump. And so I kind of had this idea. It was just an idea at first, but then as kind of the administration went on and I saw what a threat he was, and I talked to more and more people about this, I kind of decided to jump ship and to try. So we started the firm, it was July 1, I think, 2017. I think we had 4 employees, maybe 2 lawyers or 3 lawyers and maybe 5 employees. We now have 50 lawyers and 11 partners, and we're having an awful lot of fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I've seen some of the lawsuits and you seem really busy. And I plan to ask you about some of the Trump suits later. But I know within months of starting your law firm, the Charlottesville rally happened. And I read that you were watching the press with your colleagues. And I'm curious, what were you thinking at that time? How did you decide to pursue it?
Yeah, so it's really kind of interesting. The first month that we were officially a firm, we didn't have an office. We worked out of a friend's barn in the country for the first month. And our lease started, I think it was August 7th, 2017. So we deliberately put our office in the Empire State Building because the security at the Empire State Building is very good. And we assumed we were going to be having lawsuits against Donald Trump and we wanted very good security. But we're sitting in our new offices, really like on coffee tables and folding chairs with a few laptops. And the first Monday we were in there was the Monday, Charlottesville happened on August 11th and 12th. So it was the Monday after Charlottesville. And I remember thinking, okay, you know, I kind of made a suggestion. Okay, guys, oh, I'm so glad I just saw Steve's email or text about the guilty verdicts. That's wonderful. I remember thinking, you know, for lunch, we'll order in pizza and we'll watch the coverage of Charlottesville. It was incredibly naive on my part because I didn't anticipate how disturbing the coverage was going to be. And that Monday was the Monday that Donald Trump made the statement, there are very fine people on both sides. And as we were watching the coverage, I thought to myself, something needs to be done about this. This is really an incredibly disturbing development for our country. And I was very worried that the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, which is the part of our government that should have been dealing with this, probably wouldn't act, in large part because the Attorney General was then Jeff Sessions, and he did not exactly have the greatest record, to say the least, with respect to civil rights. So I thought to myself, okay, well, if the DOJ is not going to do it, someone's got to do it. And I thought back to a case that a partner who many of you probably know, who I work with very closely at Paul Weiss, Marty London, and another partner, Maria Vullo, had done at the very beginning of the internet, in connection with a website that used to be called the Nuremberg Files. And on that website, they would put up the names, personal information, residence, and photographs of doctors who performed abortions, mostly in the West and in the South. And when those doctors were injured, and one of them, I believe, was killed, they would put a red X across their face. And the theory of Marty and Maria's case was it was an incitement to violence and a violation of the Violence Against Women's Act. And they brought the case against the organizers of this website. It went to a jury trial in Portland. I think it went to the Ninth Circuit twice, as I recall. But ultimately, a very large verdict was sustained against these guys. And they then chased that verdict for many, many years, Paul Weiss, where if one of the guys got a new job, they would garnish the wages. If they tried to buy a new house, they would put a lien on the house. And it actually ended up being very effective. That's not to say there isn't horrible and scary things that happened in terms of the anti-abortion movement today, but it's nothing like it was then. And so I thought to myself, can we use that strategy or something like it here? We got a big break in the sense that someone, and to this day, I don't know who it is, managed to somehow hack into the servers on Discord that the organizers of the Charlottesville used to plan what they did in great detail. You had to be admitted to these various channels by one of two guys. And there were various channels on things like weaponry, uniforms, how to make it look like self-defense, etc. And this person who hacked in and published on a website called Unicorn Riot, all these text communications. So it was like getting discovery before a complaint. which is very, very rare, as the lawyers in this room know. And so I had certainly the desire to do it. We had the evidence right from the start. I had some of my associates look to come up with a legal theory, and that's where we had to go all the way back to the KKK Act of 1871, which I can explain if you have questions about, but somewhat ironic that we had to go to a statute that old to find a cause of action that we thought would be sustained, which it later was. And then I called a friend of mine, Dahlia Lithwick, whose people probably read her on Slate. She's a great writer about the Supreme Court and other legal issues. I actually wasn't calling her about her legal knowledge. I was calling her because I knew she lived in Charlottesville. And I called her and I said, hey, Dahlia, I have this idea. What do you think? She said, ironically, Robbie, it's really amazing that you're calling me now because we're literally packing vans to move to New York. We've decided we can't live here with she has 2 sons, with our boys anymore. The anti-Semitism is just too prevalent and too scary. But I know a whole bunch of folks down here. Come down, I'll put you in touch, and we'll see what happens. So we were on a plane to Charlottesville, I think within 48 hours. The town was still very much in a state of shock. I think it's fair to say. The white vans that a lot of these white supremacists and neo-Nazis used to drive into Charlottesville were still driving around town, particularly in the African-American neighborhoods. We met with a whole bunch of folks, but a number of those folks ended up becoming plaintiffs in our case. And it's now, I guess, a long time from that time. The case is going to trial. We got delayed a year because of COVID, because we're insisting on a jury trial. But we are going to have a jury trial in Charlottesville, Virginia, under the KKK Act of 1871 this October. So stay tuned. And I don't like to go on a limb, and I don't want to jinx myself. So I would say I'm very confident that we will win the case against all the defendants.
Well, I'm confident too and optimistic and rooting for you. Hopefully that happens. It's my understanding that you're working with Integrity First America on the case. How did that happen?
So when I had this idea, I knew that it was going to be expensive, mostly for security, frankly. There are 2 big expenses in the case. One, security. When Karen Dunn, who's done with Paul Weiss, she was in a Boy Schiller, and I went down to argue the motions to dismiss, we wore bulletproof vests from the van that we were into the courthouse, and then had to take them off. During the trial, I don't want to go into too much details of the security, but during the trial, we are going to need full 24-hour security for our witnesses, for the lawyers, etc. So there was a lot of cost for that. And I didn't know this at the time, but because the defendants in the case, people like Richard Spencer, Andrew England, Chris Cantwell, the crying Nazi, and others, kind of have the mentality of truant teenage boys. I think that's fair to say. They didn't comply with any court orders about discovery, etc. So ultimately, we basically had to agree to have them ship their iPhones and their laptops to a vendor, have them take the data off the devices, then run our searches through them, etc. And that cost about $500 a device. So that itself was very expensive too. So the idea of Integrity First for America was to have a not-for-profit that would help fund those expenses, which we knew were going to be considerable.
That makes sense. So where does the case stand now?
Yeah, so as I said, we're almost done with discovery. We have Chris Cantwell's in jail, so we still have to depose him. He's in jail for extortionate threats in New Hampshire. But we're pretty much done with that. We have expert testimony that just got their motion to exclude the expert testimony was just denied. So Deborah Lipstadt, the famous Holocaust scholar, and 2 very renowned scholars on white supremacy and neo-Nazism, particularly in the United States, will be testifying. My whole career, I've wanted this. I've never managed to succeed until this case, but we got what are known as adverse inferences, which means because the defendants violated so many court orders about discovery and about complying with various discovery demands, I think 3 of them at least claimed their iPhones somehow fell into the toilet. I mean, the stories were just insane. The judge ultimately, who's not a radical by any stretch, he's a senior Bush 1 appointee, but he granted adverse inferences against a number of them, which means that the jury will be instructed that certain facts are true. And those facts include that one of the two guys who was had the ability to let people into the Discord chats engaged in a concerted conspiracy to commit violence based on racism, which is what happened, and that the jury should assume that that's what he did. So if you want to know why I'm so confident of victory, that's one reason why I'm so confident of victory. But we will be in trial in Charlottesville, as I said, at the end of October before a jury.
Sounds good. I'll continue to follow. So shifting gears a little bit, you talked about your Trump cases. You know, 6 months after Donald Trump assumed the presidency, that's when your law firm opened. Can you tell us what it's like to litigate such high profile cases against Donald Trump? Do you believe there will be accountability? And do you have any guesses about the potential long-term widespread impact if he loses these cases, or the criminal tax cases being pursued by Manhattan DA and the New York Attorney General?
Right, so two of my cases against Donald Trump, including the one that we started, the first one that we did, are really commercial cases. I mean, it was pretty much the theory I told you about earlier. They are cases that are not really different than cases that I would have litigated for many years at Paul Weiss. The Mary Trump case is about a niece who was basically cheated out of her father's inheritance. So it doesn't really have to do with her grandfather, it has to do with her father. Was cheated out of interest that her father owned when he died by her aunts and uncles. So that's kind of a classic fraud case. The ACN case, American Communications Network, has to do with Trump's, and that was the first case we filed. It has to do with a Trump scheme, and this involves Trump and his kids, his adult kids, to fraudulently promote basically a pyramid scheme, a multi-level marketing scheme, where they appealed to very, very poor Americans to so-called invest in the scheme, but no one who invested in the scheme really made any money, and all the plaintiffs, including the class members, lost lots of money, and for them, lots and lots of money. Ironically, the way they recruited people into the scheme was kind of at these religious, almost revivalist type rallies, and Trump would go speak at those rallies. He would then, his speeches would be videotaped, and they would use those videotapes. And he had this company on Celebrity Apprentice twice. One was a double header, and he got paid millions of dollars for doing that. I actually think to this day that part of his addiction to speaking at rallies honestly may have started with respect to his fraudulent promotion of ACN. So those two cases, while I think incredibly interesting, are not that different than anything I've done for most of my career. The E. Jean case, obviously, is very different. Everyone probably knows the facts. E. Jean Carroll encountered Donald Trump many, many years ago as she was exiting the north door of Bergdorf Goodman, the 58th Street door. He was coming in just across from the Plaza Hotel. And to make a very long story short, he asked her if she would help him buy a gift for a woman. She agreed, thinking it would be a funny story. And tragically, he ended up raping her in the dressing room of the lingerie department. She kept that quiet for many, many years, even though she told two friends about it at the time. One of them, I think, completely understandably told her, "Don't do anything. He will destroy you if you try." Watching what was going on with the election and what was happening with other women and some of the other statements and other incidents with respect to Trump, she wanted to say something, and she finally wrote her own book shortly after her mother had died, because she didn't want to upset her mother, and told the story. And then he promptly went on what we call a 3-day defamation rampage, saying not only that he didn't do it, but saying that he never met her, that she was too ugly to rape, that she did it to sell books, that she was part of a conspiracy of the Democratic Party, et cetera, et cetera. So we brought originally just a old-fashioned defamation case in state court. It has morphed since then. It is now in federal court before Judge Lou Kaplan, another famous Paul Weiss alumni. And we are now litigating before the Second Circuit Trump's use of the Justice Department 10 months into the case by invoking what's called the Federal Tort Claims Act, which would, if he's right, would effectively stop the case in its tracks for technical reasons I can explain. But we just put our brief into the Second Circuit on that. The new Biden administration will need to decide what to do, and whether they will keep the position that the Trump DOJ took. And then I assume we'll have arguments in the fall.
Nice. Sounds like another important case on which to keep tuned.
Yeah. I mean, the nice thing is I've thought about this lately. Even though in a lot of ways I believe very, very deeply in the Mary Trump and the ACN fraud cases, for reasons that I think are obvious, the E. Jean case has captured, I think, the public imagination in ways that very few could. And just as Edie Windsor, I think, was the perfect plaintiff to demonstrate the injustice of the Defense of Marriage Act, I think E. Jean Carroll, I've come to the view that E. Jean Carroll is the perfect plaintiff to demonstrate the brutality and the corruption of Donald Trump. And her story is so simple that everyone can understand why he was so brutal and why he was so corrupt.
Good. And hopefully, if this is anything like the Edie Windsor case, we'll see a success, which will lead to massive accountability that follows that case. And so turning to Edie Windsor, which we can't close without discussing. I mean, everyone knows its significance. Can you share with us how you met Edie, preparing for and arguing before the United States Supreme Court and the hearing on the decision? What were the legal ramifications of its success?
Sure. So, I'm a great believer in just happenstance in life. And when things happen, if opportunities come to you, you should take them. And that's kind of what how the case started. I had a friend who was a headhunter for lawyers. And he called me one day and said, look, I know this woman, Edie Windsor. She had to pay this big estate tax because of the Defense of Marriage Act. She would like a lawyer. She's been turned down by some of the LGBT rights groups. Would you talk to her? What my friend Eddie didn't know is I knew exactly who he was, which is a whole nother story, because many years before that, when I was a third-year law student and had a difficult time coming out, I actually saw her spouse as a patient. Her spouse was a psychologist only twice, I think, the summer after I graduated law school, before I was moving to Boston to clerk. So I didn't have to ask her where she lived. I knew exactly where she lived. And I went the next day to the house. It was a little bit like coming back to the scene of an accident, though, because like all these memories that I'd kind of kept repressed, I'm very good at repression, kind of came flooding back to me. And I explained to Edie, how I knew her late spouse, Thea. And then she told me her story, and it was like just immediately apparent to me that this was the perfect case. She was so beautiful. She was so articulate. She had such a story of the kind of marriage that anyone would want to be able to have. God forbid, if any of us get multiple sclerosis the way Thea did, we would want to have a spouse like Edie Windsor. And so I told her, she told me the story. I said I would take the case. She said to me, how much is it going to cost me? And I remember doing this. And she said, oh, come on, I want to pay you. And I said, you can't possibly afford our fees. This is Paul Weiss, we'll do the case pro bono. It didn't even occur to me to ask because I knew the firm would do it. At that time, I had no idea the case was going to get to Supreme Court. I knew that a DOMA case would ultimately get to the Supreme Court. I did not know it would be ours. Preparing for the Supreme Court was, how should I put it, a tad stressful, to say the least. We spent about 3 months. I spent about 3 months being grilled in both informal and formal moot courts by the lawyers on the case and a whole bunch of other lawyers we invited to do so. Maybe getting surgery without anesthesia would be more painful, but I'm not sure. It was quite a process, including, everyone probably knows Pam Carlin, who testified at the first Trump impeachment, was my co-counsel, one of the lawyers who was grilling me all the time. But once I got in, first time kind of moves incredibly quickly. So once you're in the court, I was kind of eager to get started. I had, as the Yiddish expression, I had Spilches, like I wanted to get going. I had to wait a long time because there was a standing argument that went before mine, and then Don really got to speak before me. And so I was the last lawyer who spoke. It went by in a flash. All that I remember at the end was just this incredible feeling of relief, frankly, that I had screwed it up, or at least I thought I had screwed it up too badly. I remember turning to Pam and saying, I think I didn't screw it up too badly. And she said, no, you did not. You did great. And then the decision, which came down on June 26th, 2013 led almost directly 2 years later to Justice Kennedy's second decision, or third major gay rights decision in Obergefell, which led to a marriage equality nationwide. And I remember being stunned. I think the very first state after Windsor that said that Windsor required marriage equality was Utah. So we kind of knew if Utah was taking the position, judges in Utah were taking the position that the principles of Windsor required marriage equality, we knew we were on the right path.
Good. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over and start the question and answer. Our first question comes from 2021 Sorensen Center Fellow Colby Williams. Colby, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for being here. I was wondering, you mentioned a moment ago about the perfect plaintiffs in these cases you were speaking of. Could you share some strategies for finding those perfect plaintiffs when they don't come to us first?
I wish I had a strategy. Kobe, I would be delighted to give you that strategy if I knew what it was. But in both of those cases, the plaintiffs came to me. I think it's more a sense of realizing when you're meeting with someone who's the perfect plaintiff or the perfect person to challenge a particular injustice rather than going out and finding it. I kind of think the ability to make those distinctions and to recognize it when you see it is what really matters, if that makes any sense. I think on top of that, obviously having someone whose life tells a very simple story about what you're trying to tell about what happened here, both with E. Jean and Edie, those were obviously true, helps. They're both, honestly, I'm going to be a little petty here, but they're both very beautiful women who are very articulate and can speak for themselves in ways that, you know, a lot of people sometimes can. And that's also a huge advantage when you're litigating.
Thank you, Roberta and Colby. Everyone else should definitely feel welcome to raise their hands or enter questions into the chat. I have another question in the meantime, Roberta. You're clearly working on a bunch of cases. How do you balance the full caseload that you have?
You know, I should say, you should have asked me this a couple of weeks ago, because I thought I was doing okay balancing it up until a couple of weeks ago. But 2 weeks ago, we were hired to do the NCAA gender equity review based on the issues that happened in the women's basketball tournament. And so it's pretty extreme right now in terms of how busy I am. You know, I've always been someone who's pretty good at holding a bunch of things in my head at one time. And that's what you have to do. And the real key to litigating the way I do and the way we do is just have really, really good associates working with you, both partners and associates. And we certainly have that at my firm. So it makes my life a lot easier.
That's excellent. Well, while we wait for, oh, it looks like we have a hand raised. Let's see. Val, definitely feel free to ask your question. You're muted.
Thanks. Thank you for coming here and speaking. This is a wonderful panel. You mentioned when you were going after Trump the first time, you rented a room in the Empire State Building for the security, right? How often do you anticipate doing that? You know, is it for only big cases or certain topics? Like I imagine for the DOMA case that did you also do it then?
Yeah, ironically, there was very few security concerns in connection with the Windsor case. I remember shortly before the argument, some very right-wing Christian group said they were praying for me to lose, and that was brought to my attention. And I might have gotten a handful of emails or letters over the years, but it was actually surprisingly little. With respect to actually the Nazis, the Charlottesville case, we get a lot of hate mail and threats. The Trump cases, we get a lot of hate mail and threats, but the number one case, believe it or not, in which I get the most hate mail and threats is my representation of the actress Amber Heard, believe it or not, who was sued for defamation by her husband, former husband, Johnny Depp, and did a trial last summer in London about allegations about whether he abused her when they were married. And the degree of, I don't know how else to put it, kind of insanity on social media of the Johnny Depp fans, whether real or I suspect not all authentic, makes, believe it or not, the Trump people and the pro Charlottesville defendant people look like nothing. I'm sure that sounds crazy to you all, but that's true. But we have to be, for all those reasons, we have to be very careful about our security at the firm, and we're still in the Empire State Building in part because the security is so good. And I think any computer systems can be hacked, so I'm not trying to dare anyone to do it, but we spend an awful lot of money making sure that our technology and everything is as secure as it possibly can be.
It seems like when you're doing public interest work, there's always that risk that people who are opposed to systemic, meaningful change are going to threaten you. I see Christina Das has raised her hand. Christina.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you so much, Robbie, for being here. We really appreciate it. As someone that's followed your work for a little bit of time, I'd love to hear you talk about how you describe yourself as a traditionalist. I think that that's something that CUNY law students obviously have a lot of personality and our own energy going into the courtroom and our own theories of litigation. So I'd love to hear from you about kind of your theories of how you approach cases and also how you describe yourself as a traditionalist.
I think the most important as to how you approach cases, the most important thing that I learned, in at this point, many years of litigating is you have to be yourself. And this is an issue, honestly, that faces, I think, women attorneys much more than it faces male attorneys, because juries and judges and frankly, people aren't used to seeing women in roles as advocates quite the same way they're used to seeing men. And so I remember actually quite deliberately when I was kind of growing up at Paul Weiss thinking, like looking at partners who I think did things very well and trying to imitate their style. Like I love the way Marty London obviously approached judges. So I don't think I come close to it, but to the extent I tend to be, I think, kind of casual and more informal in the courtroom, that's very much influenced by Marty London. There were other lawyers who I thought wrote great briefs, and I would try to, learn from them and how they wrote briefs or how they argued or how they defended or took depositions. So I think I'm hoping, I'm the chair of the board of Time's Up, and I'm hoping that we're changing those attitudes slowly but surely. But it still exists, and it's a challenge for women, I think, to kind of develop a personality as what's known as a first chair litigator. But I think it's important to do. And I think you have to know in your heart what you're good at, what you're not good at, and do what you're good at and emphasize those qualities. I'm not sure the context in which I said I was a traditionalist, although I'm certainly not denying it. I'm certainly someone who believes in our system. As I said, I with all its faults and flaws, and with our very, difficult history, I still believe in our system and in our legal system's ability to kind of bend the moral arc of the universe in the right direction. The reason I think I was so motivated and energized by Donald Trump is I saw him as the single greatest risk to that. It's nice to live right now in times where it's, obviously we have the verdict today, but more or less what's coming from the president is frankly a little bit boring. I assume that President Biden takes that as a compliment, and I mean it as a compliment. It's nice to be living in a world where every day you didn't have to worry about some huge crisis happening at the hands of the president. But there's a lot more work to do for sure. And I think we had the kind of the shock of Trump and then the shock of COVID happening back to back. So we have to rebuild a lot of our institutions and a lot of our values in ways that are more open and accepting of difference for sure.
Hi, Camille.
Hi, thank you. My question is about the KKK Act and whether or not you also are going to bring in, for example, any international declarations into this case. And what makes me think of it is that Gay McDougall, who's on our advisory board, gave a talk in February on the Committee to End Racial Discrimination, CERD, the UN committee, that really focuses on ethnic strife, wars. They issue early warnings only in cases of where they do think a war will break out. And actually, they issued a warning against the US in 2017 after the Charlottesville incident. And I'm wondering if you find in this case or in any other cases that you're working on where you can pull on some of the international jurisprudence.
Yeah, we haven't thought about it. I will think about it. Knowing the judge, I think he would be reluctant to admit evidence like that. But I do think we are going to focus very much on the history. And I think the judge actually at this point, particularly given the January 6th, what happened in January 6th at the Capitol, I think the judge and the jurors are very aware of the degree to which the rise of white supremacists and neo-Nazis presents, a real ever-present danger in our country. I mean, the way I like to say it is a lot of these guys, and they're all guys who are defendants in our case, kind of before Charlottesville, they were kind of guys who lived in their parents' basements. They played video games. Discord was originally a gamer platform. And they may have had these horrible views, these racist, horrible, anti-Semitic views, but they didn't feel emboldened enough to go out on city streets and say them, and much worse than say them, commit violence motivated by them. There's no question that Trump was the motivating factor here. It's clear from the evidence that they felt motivated and emboldened by Trump to do so. And here's where I was naive. Like, I thought Charlottesville was going to be the worst thing that ever happened. What I didn't realize is as kind of time went on leading up to January 6th, all the kind of key elements of the conspiracy or key strategies that he used in Charlottesville ended up being repeated over and over. For example, Charlottesville supposedly, according to them, was about a controversy over whether to take down Civil War monuments, namely the statue of Robert E. Lee that's right in the city center of Charlottesville. Charlottesville was where driving into protesters started, right? They talked about it leading up to it, but after Charlottesville, particularly during the BLM protests, I think there were more than 60 incidents, including in New York City, of people driving their cars into protesters, blaming the what I believe completely meritless blaming of Antifa for these rallies and for this violence began in Charlottesville. What the guys who were suing in Charlottesville said is, we are doing this in self-defense against Antifa, whatever that means. Again, that continued throughout the summer, throughout BLM and leading up to January 6th. And perhaps most disturbingly, the ability of these guys, again, if you use my metaphor, kind of living alone in their parents' basements, the ability that social media provides them to organize in ways that were never, ever possible before makes this not only a national problem, and of course, it's the single greatest threat the FBI has said facing our country today, but a huge international problem. The guy who shot Christchurch in New Zealand had a symbol on his rifle called a fashtag, fascist and hashtag, they think they're very clever, that was invented by one of the defendants in our Charlottesville case, Matthew Heimbach. The defendants in our case were communicating with the guy who shot the synagogue in Pittsburgh. This is not right now just a national network or a local network, it's an international network, and it is very, very dangerous. In the past, the KKK, going back in history, was passed to stop a bunch of white guys hiding under white hoods from meeting in the forests of Mississippi or Alabama. They don't need to have hoods anymore, they have hashtags, and they don't need to meet in the forest. All they do is go online. And there's no question that I mean, I'm very comforted by the fact that Attorney General Garland and the DOJ is very committed to combating this. But we kind of let it go on unchecked for all 4 years of the Trump administration, and now we have a very, very serious problem. The only other thing I think I want to say about it is I don't get shocked very often, in the sense that I've done a lot and I have pretty thick skin. The one part of the Charlottesville case that truly shocked me when reading their messages is while they hate everyone, I truly understood intersectionalism when I read their messages, because they hate Black people, they hate Jewish people, they hate women, they hate immigrants, you name it, Muslims, gay people, they hate them all. But the degree to which they seem to be most prominently motivated by anti-Semitism shocked me. And the reason it shocked me so much is, obviously I'm Jewish, but the reason it shocked me so much is most of these guys come from rural areas. I assume they don't know a lot of Jews. So the idea that they were all coming to Charlottesville inspired by this replacement theory, this theory that there is some guy with, controlling Jewish space lasers that is somehow controlling all the other minority groups, was truly shocking to me. And it's something we really have to be careful about going forward. Because again, if they hate the Jews, I guarantee you they hate Black people. I guarantee you they hate immigrants, et cetera, et cetera.
I agree with the point about intersectionality. It's quite common that where you find hatred for Jews, you'll find it for Blacks, for women, for everyone else. Our next question is from Sylvia Alexander, who is a CUNY Law alum and Sorensen Center supporter. Do you think Donald Trump will ever be held accountable, and will he always operate with impunity?
I am spending an awful lot of hours every single day trying to hold him accountable. I am quite confident that he will be held accountable by our legal system. I can't tell you sitting here today in exactly which form, whether it will be the Manhattan AG investigation. It certainly comforts me that Mark Pomerantz is now working on that, another Paul Weiss partner, or it will be any of my cases, or it'll be the Sumner Zervos case that Beth Wilkinson is handling. I'm not sure which matter it will be, probably more than one. But I'm quite confident that he will be held accountable. And I think Eugene Carroll is frankly a very prime candidate to be able to do that. Whether or not he goes to jail, that I don't know. But I think what he has done to our country, the way he has brutalized women, the way he has corrupted our Department of Justice, the way he has cheated poor, working class Americans out of their hard-earned money, I think that's all going to be exposed. The way he cheated on his taxes.
Yeah, we'll see, and hopefully. So our last question, you've worked on so many different causes to date. Are there any causes you hope to take up that you haven't had the chance to work on yet?
I'm not sure. I'm sure there will be, and I'm sure I'll get a call tomorrow or the day after or a month from now with a case or a matter that will inspire me the same way that these have. There are more than enough problems to go around, unfortunately in our country today. And I'm quite sure that I'm hoping that I will have the energy and the ability to do so. I think the one thing that worries me the most, and I kind of signaled it in a couple of minutes ago, is the risks imposed by kind of an unregulated internet. And I'm certainly a big believer in free speech, and I don't believe that people's speech should be restricted in violation of the Constitution. But the ability that people have on the internet anonymously to attack others, and I saw this with Amber Heard, I still see it every day. Actually, the lawyer for Johnny Depp just today, I believe, got permanently suspended from Twitter. But it took a very long time for it to get to that point, and a lot of damage to Amber and her family and her friends. That really worries me very much, because I don't know if we can get to a point in this country where we can agree on a core group of principles and facts with this amount of disinformation and conspiracy theory and just plain old lies in social media and on the internet every single minute of every single day.
Got it. So if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank you, Robbie, and turn it back to Camille. And one last question I have actually thinking about is Ted Sorensen. Are there any thoughts you have on him? I know you briefly commented on him earlier, but any closing thoughts?
I mean, look, he lived a life both in public service and as a private lawyer that any one of us, myself included, should aspire to. He made a great difference in his life to our country and for many other people. And the one area I can't even touch him, he had literally the best speaker I've ever seen in my life, with the best sense of humor I've ever seen in my life. I can't even come close to Ted on that. But you know, I often when I get up to speak, I think about what he would say, and I know I don't come anywhere close to it. But he's still an inspiration to us, and we have to go back, I think, to these lives, to this ideals of living in both public service and in you know, doing private practice or private business, and they're not antagonistic to each other. They can be fused together the way Ted did in his lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a big part of like that public interest tilt of what the Sorensen Center is about. So I'll turn it back over to Camille.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you so much, Robbie. And hearing you talk about Ted just makes me miss him. I agree with you completely. And it's wonderful and an honor to be at CUNY Law at the Sorensen Center and get to see his legacy continue with so many of the people who are on this call and others. We just are getting ready to announce 30 Sorensen Center Fellows in 2021. A few who are on this call this afternoon with you. So it's an exciting time for the work to continue. And thank you for taking the time to do this. And more than that, thank you for the incredible work you're doing, Robbie. I think it's an inspiration to all here and to all who will hear this recording. So we really appreciate it. And it's especially poignant that we were in this call with you and with Scott as the verdict came down. This has been such an emotional time for all of us. And I think waiting for this verdict and reckoning as a nation with all of the racism and hate and how to combat it. And here we were in this conversation, hearing about you doing this work. So we will follow it and be with you in spirit in October in Charlottesville, and look forward to staying in touch. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a true pleasure.
And thank you all for coming.